We'll spend like 10 minutes doing Flexbox. I'll do a little intro to Git, so I'm praying you didn't come to the like QWeb QHacks Git intro, because if you did, get ready to do it all again. And then we'll introduce you to React, which is sort of the meat of what we're hoping to get to. And then next week, we'll hit you with even more React. So if you've done any React before, today we're just going to cover some component stuff, which helps you sort of make your website a little bit faster. If you're finding that you're copying and pasting a lot of HTML code, we're going to kind of hopefully fix that using React. But first, today we're going to cover Flexbox, which is just an add-on sort of to CSS, and it lets us easily and dynamically sort of set up your website, right? So you've probably gone onto a website before on your phone, and everything automatically adjusts and gets smaller based off the size of your website. And Flexbox is one of the tools that you can use to actually do that, right? Everything will change its size dependent on the size of the user's screen. And so we need some sort of way to actually work with Flexbox, and these are some of the commonly used terms. And so the only ones that really matter are just container and items. And so if you think of the container as it's just going to be like the outer div that you're going to store everything in, and then within it you're going to have a bunch of items, and according to the rules that you write in your CSS, they'll be aligned based off of your Flexbox rules, right? So in this case, they're just aligned horizontally beside each other, but you could have them going vertically, or you could style them in any way that you so choose. And so I think the best way to show off Flexbox really is to just show you a few quick examples to show you sort of what it's for and what you can use it for. And then from there, you can sort of look at documentation or look at examples on Stack Overflow for sort of the extra steps as to what you could possibly do. So for this week, I have this little base website example. I've just called it flex.html, and all that I've really done here is created a simple website, right? Going back to what we did in week 1, all of this starter code, right? We create a header, we create a body, and then within our body, I just have one outer div. And notice how I gave it a class of container, right? That's how we're going to style it, is using the class syntax this week. And I've also created 3 sort of divs within it, and those each have a class of item, right? So this is that container item sort of mix that we have on this diagram in HTML. And so I also have a style.css file here, and you'll notice we just gave it some random styling, most of which you've seen before, right? So we're changing the font size, we're adding a blue border, we're adding an orange border and a blue border. But the most important one here that's actually new is we've added display flex right here to our container, and that basically says we want everything within this div to be styled in terms of Flexbox. And so if we actually open up this site in our web browser, we should see that everything will sort of align itself according to the size of the content, right? So here is our outer container there in orange, right? So you can see our border, and then in blue are each of our items right there. And so it doesn't really look like Flexbox is doing very much other than putting the items beside each other, right? In the past, if we had just done this in raw HTML, they would have just been over top of each other, but now they're actually beside each other. But where Flexbox gets really cool is when you have items that actually have different sizes, right? So if I go back to my code here, and if I uncomment this massive div that I have here where I typed a bunch of random stuff, and if I save my file and head back over, of course I'll have to refresh, but you'll see that everything adjusts to the size of the content, right? And this may not seem like it would be very useful right now because we're just writing static HTML and CSS, but once we head into React and we make our website truly dynamic, dependent on what the user does, resizing it based off of the content is going to be very important and very useful. And so that's mainly what Flexbox aims to do. And so now that we have sort of shown you the basics of Flexbox, we're going to show you a few more quick CSS commands that will help you out with it. And the first one is flex direction. And so if I head over to my style tab in the container, I can define a flex direction. And I could, for example, maybe make this a column. And if I save this and go ahead and refresh, you'll see that everything is now arranged in a column-like fashion. And it turns out that by default, Flexbox assigns everything in a row-like fashion. So if I go back and say row and save it, you'll see that we go back to the original thing. And so this may seem a little bit annoying, right? I'm switching back between VS Code and back to my website and having to refresh it every time. And that's actually where our development tools that we showed you earlier come in handy, right? We can inspect our website here. We can grab our selector and we can select our element. And you can see it selected on the right side. We know that it's the right element because it has a class of container. And now down here, we can see here's all of our styles, right? And I've made this a little bit too big, but you can see here's our display flex, and here's all of the styling that's being pulled in from our CSS page. But most importantly, at the very top here, we have this element.style, and we can start typing styling in here, and the website will automatically change, right? If I, for example, change the font size to maybe be large, or larger, you can see that the website instantly changes, right? And so that's how we can start to show you even more of these Flexbox items. The next one is we can use flex wrap, and we can turn it on to wrap. And that's essentially like text wrapping in like a text editor, which essentially just means that it's going to, instead of making all of the boxes like one size, it'll do it dependent on how long the text is, right? That one's a little bit hard to explain, but it's useful if you're displaying a lot of text. We can also use justify content, and that will allow us to change how the items are spaced between each other. And so if we, for example, were to set this to flex end, everything is set in terms of sort of the end points, if that makes sense. It seems a little bit confusing, but we're essentially flipping what we were doing before, where they were starting at the start, we're now starting at the end and working backwards. There's a few others. We can change the alignment of everything. So we can say maybe align items, and we can maybe set it to the center, or we could set it to the left or the right. There's not enough space on my site, unfortunately, to see that. But if we were to maybe turn off our justify content and turn off our align items, this is what it is by default. But if we were to use both, maybe if we were to say justify content and put that to the center, and then if we were also to align our items to the center, you'll see that everything within our div right here is centered, right? All of the content pages at the top are centered, and because we have that flex wrap on, this bottom element doesn't look centered, but that's because it's taking up all of the space. And so this is one of the ways to answer that old web development problem of like, how do you center something on your website? Well, it turns out one of the easiest ways that you can do that is make it a flex box and then put all of your content to the center, and then you'll be good. Everything will be nice and centered. So to like summarize, you could do a lot more with Flexbox. We just wanted to give you a brief little teaser, and not to go over Flexbox for like 40 minutes and bore you, but hopefully this shows you why it's very prevalent and used in the industry. And there's a bunch of sites that will show you maybe a more interactive way for you to learn this. I would suggest you try them out. But if you're trying to display a bunch of content and you want it to change and still look good based off the different sizes that your website could be viewed on, Flexbox is definitely the way to go, right? If I were to view this on a mobile device, I can still read everything. And if I were to view this on the desktop, I can also still read everything. And so we have one quick example here within Club 2, within our starter code of that. It is essentially just a version of our previous site, except we're using Flexbox to style part of it. So if we open up club.html here, you'll see, I think it's down here in the footer, we use Flexbox in order to align these different links here together. And right, you can see that if I start zooming in and everything, they're realigning and changing size, right? And if I quickly just show you our club.html and head down to the footer, you'll see that we're using a very similar setup where we have a class. In this case, I called it footer container. And then within our footer container, we have footer container items. And if we head into our CSS, it turns out that our footer container is going to have our Flexbox on, and each of our items are also styled differently. So if I find footer container, you'll see that I have my my display flex on to signify that it's Flexbox. So that's about it that we're going to show you for CSS this week. We covered CSS very briefly last week. The reason that we're only covering CSS very briefly is because in the week after, we're hoping to introduce you to Tailwind CSS, which is essentially a React CSS library. And so just like how you were using class names before and then writing your CSS in a separate CSS file, Tailwind essentially allows you to use those class names without writing your own CSS. And so you'll be able to reuse their CSS in order to make your website a little bit faster, and it'll follow a lot of design principles that are very popular within the industry. And so that's why we're only showing you a basic intro to CSS. You can definitely write your entire website from scratch with your own CSS if you want to, but we'll show you Tailwind next week, and it'll be a little bit faster. So next, we want to show you a brief introduction to Git, And the reason we're showing you this is in the winter term, you're going to work ideally in a team of around 4 to create your own website, right? Usually for a business in Kingston or for maybe a Queen's club. And so you need to work together to build this website, right? You can't just do it on one singular device. And so you need a way to share your code with each other and collaborate. And so Git is essentially a tool that allows you to do that, right? It allows multiple people to work on the same project by utilizing something called forks, which is where you essentially take one version of the project and you all get your own local version to work on it. You type some code and then you say, hey, I want to share my code with all of my other developers. You give your code back to the other developers. They're like, okay, your code looks good. And then your code then shows up on all of their machines. And so that's the premise behind Git. It's kind of like a Google Docs, but for programming, if that makes sense, except it's a little bit less live and a little bit more history-based, if that makes any sense. But the first thing that we need to do when we're using any new software is, unfortunately, we have to download it and install it. So if you just Google Git, you'll find the Git website. You can download it for your operating system, and I would urge you to do that right now. I've already installed it, so I'm going to very quickly steam ahead. But once you have Git installed, you'll have this Git bash terminal right here. And so if you open that up, this is a great place for you to write all of your Git commands. And I'll just zoom in a whole bunch. We don't know how much terminal experience you have, so I'll very briefly go over the other commands that I'm using as well, just in case, so fear not. First thing I'm going to do is type ls, and I'm going to list out the files that are in this directory. If I want to know where I'm on my computer, I can do pwd, which just means print working directory. That just tells you where you are on your computer, right? So this is telling me I'm in C users Josh, and that makes sense, right? So I can then, now that I've listed out everything in here, I can use cd, which just means change directory, and I'm going to go into the QWeb folder, and in there, I'm going to make another folder using mkdir, which just stands for make directory, and in here, I'm just going to call it git test. Then once more, I'm going to cd into git test, and that's about all that I'm going to do now, right? If I type ls, I'm just in an empty folder. It turns out that we're going to ask you to use GitHub for your project, which is essentially a web-hosted version of Git, if that makes sense. They give you a few extra tools, not many of which we're going to use, but suffice to say, it's a way for your other developers to be able to easily grab your code, right? They can go on the GitHub website and they can grab it right away. So once you've created a GitHub account of some sort, you can head over to their website. Right, it's just github.com. And from here, when we're creating a new project, the first thing that we're going to want to do is hit this very small plus button in the corner and make a new repository. And so I'll do that with you right now. And then you have to give it a name and you have to give it some sort of description. But for now, I'll just call this maybe a QWeb test. And my description, I've already done that. And this description just will be, I don't know, I'm testing. And then you can decide whether you want your repository to be public or private. I'm just going to make mine public. It doesn't really matter. If you make yours private, you won't be able to clone it or do anything with it unless you're logged in to your specific GitHub account. For now, public is fine. If you think you need private, then that's probably a good time to select the option, or you can have a quick chat with us, but for most cases, public is fine. It'll ask you, you could choose a license if you want, and you can choose a git ignore file. I'm not going to do anything with that right now. I'm just going to create repository. And so now I've created this project, right, that I want to start working on. Maybe I want to make a website. Maybe I want to make my own personal site or something similar. And you'll see down here, there's this quick setup guide for actually getting this project onto your local device. And it turns out we're going to grab this link right here. You can also grab it. Usually once there's some files here, there'll be a clone or download button. It's green in the corner, but because we've just made our project, it's not there. But under this quick setup guide, there'll be a link right here, and we're going to grab that. And if we head back over to our terminal, right where we installed Git, it turns out that Git has a command for us to convert that link into the project on our own device. And you can do that using git clone. So we can just type git clone, and then if we paste in the link right here and hit enter, you'll see that it'll clone into this directory. And so when you do this for the first time, when you say git clone and you type a link, it's going to ask you to sign in with your GitHub account. You should be able to just click open in browser and authenticate that way, and then hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will work. And so now I've cloned my repository, right? It was empty, so there's no real easy way to tell, but if I type ls, I'll see right here I have a folder called QWeb test 2, and if I cd into QWeb test 2, I am now within my Git repository, right? And so this is where I can start to make my project. If I were to head maybe over to VS Code, right, I can open that folder using right file, open folder, and if I browse to it, right, it's on my C drive, it's within QWeb, and then I made one called, I've forgotten where it is. If I do print working directory, I can see that again, right? It's within QWeb, and then git test. Okay, it's in C users, Josh, interesting. But once you open that up, right, you can start to create your project just like how you would normally, right? You'll start to create your website, you'll make an HTML file, etc. And then you can start to share it with your fellow developers, right? So if I go into git test and if I go into QWeb test 2, I open this up. Now I can, right, edit my project just like usual, right? I can make a HTML file, right? I'll just call it test.html and I'll just make a div in here, right? And I'll just say hello. And I'll save this, right? And you'll notice that now that I've saved it, unfortunately, nothing's actually happened on my repository up here, right? Nobody else can see my code and nobody else can continue to work on it, right? Maybe I wanted to say, hey, my friend's really good at CSS. Can you make my div orange, right? I need to give them this code somehow, and it's not up here. And so it turns out, once I'm done writing my code, I need to create what's called a commit. And we can essentially think of this as like a version of our project that we want to save in our history for later. And so the way that we do that is first we have to say, hey, what files do you want to include in your commit? What files do you want to send along? Because sometimes you make a test file or something and you don't want to show that to all your friends. You can then say git add in order to add a specific file. And so in this case, I'm just going to do git add star, and it turns out that that will add all of the files in this directory. So if I do that, and if I hit enter, nothing really seems to happen. But in general with Git, if I then write git status, I can maybe see that, hey, on my git status, I have changes to be committed, and it looks like I have this new file, test.html. And so maybe everything is working. Next, I'll make that commit, right? I want to save this file in my sort of Git history. Maybe everything in my project breaks and I want to revert back to an earlier version of it. This is the version that I'm going to revert back to. So I'm going to say git commit, and I'm going to use -m because I want to write a little message saying, hey, this is the first version of our project or something like that. All right, and I'll just close the parentheses. And so whatever we include in the parentheses is the message. And I realize it's a little bit hard to see with it all the way at the bottom, but there we go. If I hit enter, it'll now say, hey, one file has changed with 3 insertions. And that's a little bit cryptic, but it means that I've made one file and I've made 3 lines of changes. And if I actually head back to my VS Code, that actually makes sense because I have 3 new lines technically that were added, right? My div, and my hello. So everything seems to be okay. If I head back over to my website and I refresh, my Git repository, and if I refresh, unfortunately, there's still nothing there. Even though I've made that commit, I haven't actually given it to my GitHub site for other people to use. And it turns out we have to push those changes up to our GitHub repository in order for other people to be able to use them. Right? So if I then said git push, hopefully it'll say everything is all right, and it'll push our changes up. Right? You can see here, it moved all of my changes to my GitHub account, QWebTest2.git. And so I think everything's okay. If I head back over to my repository and if I refresh, everything's looking good, right? So we can see my commit right here. You can see my message, hey, this is the first version of our project. We can see in the corner here that there's been one commit. If I click on the commit itself, it'll show you all of the changes within that commit. So if I scroll down here, I'll see the changes that I made to that file. And if I click back, we can see that this is just sort of that base version. And this is the link that we can send to our fellow developers to ask them to help out on our site. So I'll give you like 3 minutes. Try to install Git, and then head over to GitHub, make a repository, and try to clone that to your local machine. It should just be an empty file to start, but once you've got it cloned to your machine, if you've got a little bit of extra time, try to git add something, and then git commit it, and then git push, and see if you can get it to show on your GitHub repository. All right, hopefully you gave it a try. If you got stuck, just let us know after, and we'll help you out, and we'll sort of show you the steps again. But now that we have our little base GitHub repo set up, we're going to do one more thing that you'll find very useful in the in the winter development sprint, and that is create a branch. And so it turns out having 4 or 5 or 6 developers all working on the same specific version of the code leads to a bunch of mess being created, right? You're all editing the same files and you're all making changes to the same website, and somewhere down the line, both of you are going to have a different version of the site, and that's really problematic. And so it turns out that we have this neat feature called branching. And branching essentially takes the current version of the site, and it gives you your own sort of workspace to work on it. And then what you do is, once you're done working on the feature or the thing that you're adding to the site, you take your branch and you combine it back with the original tree, and then your code has been combined with the full project, and then other developers will get your code onto their machine. So I guess the workflow is kind of like you make a branch for something that you're adding to your site. Maybe you want to add a contact us form, so you branch off for that. You make your contact us form, you have another developer look at it, make sure it's all okay, make sure you didn't make any glaring bugs like I often make up here, and then you submit a request for that code to be put into the main version of the site, and then it's placed in the main version of the site, and then whenever someone else works on the site, your code, your contact us page, will then be included. And so I'll very briefly show you the steps for how you do that. And so it turns out to make a branch, what we can do is we can say git branch, and that will show us what branch we're on. If we want to get a new branch, we can use the checkout command, right? So we can say git checkout, and then we can give ourselves a branch name. And so in this case, I'll give the branch name just Josh, and whoops, is it -m? I've forgotten the command. Does anyone remember? Git checkout? It should be B. Turns out to make a new branch, you have to do -b, and so it's yelling at me because the Josh branch doesn't exist. I swear I did this last week. So now I've created a new branch called Josh, and I've switched to my new branch. And right, if I type git branch once more, we'll see that I'm on the Josh branch. And it'll also list our other branches, right? We have main, which is the main version of our site, and we have Josh, which is my version. You also see in your terminal, this blue text will tell you what branch you're currently on. So that's a little bit useful. And now if I head back over to VS Code, maybe I make a change, right? This is the Josh version of the site, so surely this should say Josh instead of hello. And maybe we want, I don't know, maybe I want an image. But I don't want to have a source, so it's just going to be blank. That's fine. I don't have one for now, and that's all great, right? I'm going to go through the same steps that I did before. I'm going to git add, and I'm going to add the file that I worked on, which in this case is just a file called test.html, right? Remember before I used a star to add all the files, but in this case, I'm just going to add a specific one, and that's okay. I'm going to say git status, and I'm going to see, hey, I modified a file called test.html. That's all good. That sounds good. And I'm going to commit it, right? Because I want to save this for later. I'm going to give it a message, and I'm going to say Josh is added to the site. Now everything seems good. If I head back over to my GitHub repository, once again, nothing's changed, and that's okay because I haven't pushed it up. Excuse me, I haven't pushed it up. And so if I say git push, hopefully now everything will be pushed up. And you see in this case I get an error. It says the current branch Josh has no upstream branch, and that's a little bit confusing. But what that really means is I haven't said which part of the repository I'm working off of. And in this case, I'm working off of the sort of main branch, which in this case is called the origin branch. And so that's all that this command is telling me, is saying, hey, here's a potential fix. If you type this command, you'll set the upward branch to be the main branch, which just means that when I try to put all of my changes back in the end, they'll be going into that main branch. And so it's a little bit confusing because in this case it's called origin, and on my computer it's called main, and the reason for that is the origin branch is essentially GitHub's main branch, if that makes any sense. So what I'm saying here is the Josh branch is sort of an offshoot of the origin branch. I'm going to do some work, and then I'm going to put it back into that origin branch again at the end. And so if I run this command right here, everything should hopefully work out. And we'll see that Josh is set to track the origin branch, and that's all good. If we head back over to my repository, it says, hey, Josh has had a recent push less than a minute ago, but if I look for my change, it doesn't appear to be here within test.html, right? This is just going to show me my original div hello code. But if I head back over to my site, there's this little button here in the corner that looks like a branch, and it turns out there's my Josh branch down here, and we'll see that my change is there, right? You can see my git commit message right there. Josh is added to the site. And believe me, in this test.html file, my changes are there. So that's all great, but now we need a way to take my changes and put them back onto the main branch of the site, right? Maybe my fellow developer Sky is also working on something and my amazing changes need to be in there right now so that Sky can keep working. Well, it turns out the way that we do that is by creating a pull request, right? We need to request from our other developers to say, hey, can my code be combined with yours? Hopefully they'll say yes, and once they do, we merge that code back in, and then other people will begin to use it. So if I head over to my main page, it turns out because I've recently pushed code, it gives us this neat little button here called compare and pull request that we can use, but we can also just hit the pull request button at the top, and we can say, hey, I want to make a new pull request. And then what we do is we say, hey, the branch that I made all of my changes on is called Josh, and the branch that I want to merge it into is called main. And so you can see at the top here, that's all set up, right? Josh is going to merge into main, and it says, hey, GitHub's all happy with me. I'm able to merge. That's wonderful. It'll show me all the changes that were done down here, right? I deleted the hello line, I added the Josh line, and I added a blank image. I can give it a title now. Once I click create a pull request, it's just called Josh is added to the site. And then I will create said pull request. Everything seems good. Maybe I had another developer look at my code and it's all great. They're like, you're doing so well. Now I can go down here and I can actually click merge pull request, and that will actually merge my code into that main branch. And I have to confirm again just in case. But now, once I've merged in, if I head back over to my repository here, QWeb test 2, right now I'm on the main branch, and you'll see that there's a merge message here, right? I merged my pull request in, and if I head over to test.html, all of my changes are there. So now one final thing, if I head back over to my terminal here, and if I say git checkout main, right? That's our main branch, right? If I do git branch, you'll see once again, I'm now on the main branch, not the Josh branch. And if I head over to my VS Code, and if I open my test.html file, it looks like it's just hello, right? That's not all of the changes that we have made, right? We know that our main branch on our GitHub site has that cool message about Josh, but it's not here. And it turns out that when changes are made to a branch that you're working on by someone else, you have to tell your device to actually pull those changes down from the cloud. And so in this case, just like the git push command, the opposite to that is the git pull command. And so if we say git pull, we'll see in a second here, all of those changes are going to be pulled down onto my local device. And now I can see my change right here. And so one common problem that people will run into is before they start writing their code, they'll forget to git pull, and then they'll run into a bunch of issues because the new contact us page that your teammate made isn't there, and that's what I was supposed to work on. And so that's a pretty common mistake. Make sure that you pull your code before you start working on it. And so one final very quick thing, Gabe's gonna get mad at me because I'm going over time, but it turns out there's a really cool software application called GitHub Desktop, which gives you a graphical version of all of this. So if you head over to their sites and just Google GitHub Desktop, it's completely free, and it is basically a GUI for all the things that I just showed you. And the reason that I showed you it in the terminal was so that I could show you what each individual command did, and some things won't always work on the GUI version of GitHub Desktop, but if I do file and if I add a local repository, I can browse to the one that I've created here. So if I go to C and to users, all that jazz, I can also, right within this interface, clone a repository if I so chose to, and all of that, it would just ask you where you want it to be, and it would all work out for you. So if I click Add Repository, we should see here is my repository setup, right? If I made a quick change in test.html, right? If I said Josh again, and if I save the file, we can see the change show up right here. It'll show us all of the changes that we've made. In the bottom left, I can make a commit message, and if I just say commit message, I can commit it right to main, and it'll even prompt us to make sure that we push up to GitHub. And so if you're a brand new person to Git, I suggest that you outfit your entire team with GitHub Desktop. It may not be as powerful as the command line version of the tool, but it is a set of safety wheels that will help you out and make sure that hopefully your repository does not turn into a mess. And so I'll turn it over to Gabe, who's going to do the React of today.
That is not his name.
What? There you go.
Testing.
Yeah. I would clip it to your shirt though.
Okay.
If you want. GitHub is very pro code. I don't know why.
I'm code. Do nothing but.
So you write so much code.
Me? What code was it?
360? You mark so much code.
I didn't mark shit.
You like code so much. You mark it.
Testing,
I
testing.
didn't mark anything that they.
Okay, well, you just didn't do your job, and that's all that.
I didn't hate. I'm getting paid to know.
That's true. Yes. Good choices are being made.
Oh no. What is the context of?
Look at my site.
I love it. Why didn't we show
Home
that
and
off?
context. Else you don't need anything else.
Why didn't we show that off after like week 2?
Put pineapple on your pizza.
Yeah.
That should be an interactable thing. That like puts pineapple on your pizza.
Oh my god. It like switches the image out, like with a slideshow transition, and then it shows the pizza with time.
Pineapple pizza.
And it's rainbow.
That lady for
It is scientifically proven that pineapple pizza increases
Josh?
your
Yeah.
Need help?
10 years? That's insane.
I don't think the
That's not
So that one?
contact page does.
Silly.
Okay.
The contact page doesn't.
See, everything becomes small.
It won't,
So
it won't do
annoying.
anything.
Okay.
Do you like pineapple?
Yes.
Okay.
Is this a real website they can go to right now? Yeah, just type in localhost. Let me
Yeah, you can access this website if you go to localhost 3000.
and like
Uh,
3,000 or something?
Yeah.
Is this mic working? Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Wait, no,
Okay.
here it is. I found the guess.
Okay. So hello, my name is Gavin. I'm part of the QWeb education team. And for the remainder of the tutorial today, we're just going to go over a technology called React. So React, we're going to go over the essentials of React, why we use React, how we use React. Unfortunately, we won't be going over everything there is to know about React because it's a very, very complicated technology. But we will be teaching you enough of the essentials to get you started to build a very simple website, maybe during the winter term. So this is a website built by React. Looks pretty cool. People Watching Club, keeping with the theme. And so before we are able to use React, we have to install something called Node. So let's head over to Google and search Node. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. Node, N-O-D-E, should be the first one. Okay, so what Node is if you think about it, when we're writing JavaScript, every single time we write JavaScript, it runs on the browser. What Node allows us to do is it essentially allows us to execute JavaScript outside of the browser. And we will need that if we were to write any React code. So go ahead and download the LTS, which stands for long-term support. It just means that this version is stable. So if you click on that, it should download it for you and open up the installer, follow the instructions, yada, yada, yada. And once you're done with all of that, you can go ahead and open up the terminal. So again, if you're on Windows, you can use PowerShell. You can use Git Bash, as Josh has already shown. You can also use WSL. If you don't know what any of that means, that's totally fine. You can ask any of us. We can help you out. And if you're on a Mac, you can use the terminal app. So I'm going to use the terminal. And from here, we can just cd into the folder that we want the React project to be in. So in this case, so I'm in the code folder. Let's say I want to change into, I have a QWeb folder for all stuff QWeb. So now I'm in the QWeb folder, and let's say this is where I want my React project to be. Okay, I'm going to zoom in here. It's tiny. Okay. All right. So now we're in the QWeb folder. From here, we can actually create our React project. Now, before we do that, we have to make sure that Node is properly installed. And to do that, we type in node-v. What this will do is check if, it will check the version of the node that is installed. If it is installed, it will just give you the version. If it's not installed, it will just say command not found. And similarly with npm, npm comes with Node. npm is it stands for Node Package Manager. And what it essentially is a tool or a program that allows you to manage code that is written by other people, including React. So once you have the versions, which means once you've installed Node properly and NPM, we can go ahead and actually create our first React project. Now I will admit, I think the hardest part about React, for me at least, is configuration and just setting everything up. It's really annoying. So if you're confused, again, don't be afraid to ask any of us. We can help you out individually. So to create a React project, an empty React project, we type in npx, which stands for node package execute, create React app. That just creates a React app. And the name of the app is my app. So again, npx space create-react-app, and then the name of your app. I'm going to type in my app, so that will be the name of my app. Enter, and it's going to do its thing. It's going to install React, install a bunch of things, install all the things that are necessary for React to work properly, which is quite a bit. So this will take a while. So while that's running, I'm heading over to here, and for this tutorial, we're going to try to recreate this little website here built with React. So we have a little introduction section here. We have places to watch people. There's the Eiffel Tower. You can watch lots of people there. Empire State Building, yeah. CN Tower. You can watch lots of Canadians there, I think. But you'll see that all these cards are pretty similar. I mean, they're really the same thing. The only difference is that the image is different, the title is different, the coordinates are different, but the style is the same, they look the same, the format is the same. So this is what React is built for. This is the power of React, is that we can essentially, instead of duplicating chunks of HTML, so you imagine like this is like a div and this is like a div, instead of like duplicating that in your HTML file, you can use React to define it once and then reuse it over and over again. So this will save a lot of time, and if you want to change a thing about this card, all you have to do is change it in one place, and everything will change. So that's really, really cool. And of course, in the tutorial, we'll also be teaching you other things about React that makes it extremely powerful. So now that we have this set up, it says here cd my app, so it tells me to change directory into that app, so I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to open it up on VS Code, so I'm going to type code and then this directory. You can just open up VS Code and then go to File, Open in that folder. That's fine too. So once you have that project opened up, you can go ahead and open up. I'm going to zoom in here. You can open up the terminal. This is the integrated terminal in VS Code. You open this up with Control tilde, the button below Escape, and this will automatically bring up a terminal that will just be in the project root directory, so this directory, and then we can type in npm start. What this does is essentially it starts up a development server, and development server is just a program that serves your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files so that you can look at it in your browser. So you run that, npm start, and there you go. We have a running React template. This is a template. We didn't write any of this, obviously, but it works. So I know that's a lot to take in. You have to install Node, get npm running, Node running, and also set up create React app. So I'm actually going to give you guys maybe like 3 to 5 minutes to have that set up. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So. How? Yeah.
The switch, it'll turn it off.
Okay.
Once the light's off, it's no longer on. Other side. There you go.
like with accent.
In the backyard.
We don't like this.
That's so disrespectful.
Okay.
Left behind.
So hopefully everyone has a template running. I guess part of it, if you have actually, I just want to like have an experiment. Raise your hand if you have experience with React or Node. Oh, that's actually not okay. I thought more people would. Anyways, it's great. It's actually great because I'm actually teaching something. I thought, oh, you guys are all experts in this. Okay. So we have a template running. That's nice. Let's head over to our project. I'm going to close this terminal because it's gigantic. Okay, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what's going on with these files. This is quite a lot of file, it's way more than just an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we have a node modules folder, and in this folder we have all the we have React installed. We have all the necessary code that is needed for React to work. They're all installed in this folder called node modules, which means you don't really have to touch them. They're other people's code, and they just work. Here we have the public folder. The public folder is where we store everything that's not JavaScript or CSS. In React, you'll just be writing JavaScript and CSS. You won't be writing HTML. So, for example, images or icons or even HTML that we will load on the browser, these will all be stored in the public folder. And here we have the source folder. This is where we store all our JavaScript and CSS. This is where we will spend the majority of our time in. We have the git ignore. This just tells what git to not track. So for example, you would normally not want to track the node modules folder because it's gigantic. You don't want to push it to the public repository. And we have the package.json, which just defines all the dependencies. Dependencies are other people's code. So like React and all the stuff that's needed. It's all defined here. And yeah, and you have the README, of course, which just explains what this project is. And that's pretty much it. We will be spending the majority of our time in this folder right here, the source folder. This is the actual HTML that will be loaded on the browser. And we see here that we have a div. This div has an ID of root. And actually, this is where React will render all of its content in. So inside this div, React will render all of its stuff. So before we actually do anything, we can go ahead and just delete some of these files because some of these are just either unnecessary or they're just there because we have the template running and we don't really need the template. So really in the source folder, we just need two things, the app.js file and the index.js file. So we're going to delete the app.css. We're going to create our own app.test.js, index.css, this logo, report web vitals, setup tests, all that. So now in the source folder, we just have two files, app and index. Now in the index.js file, this file is actually what will be loaded in the browser. So this is what the browser actually executes. From here, we have a bunch of import statements. We can go ahead and delete some of these import statements because we don't need them. So similar to the files, I'm going to delete the report web vitals. I'm going to delete the index.css because it's no longer there. So we're just left with importing React, React DOM, and an app. Of course, we don't need this report web vitals here. So I'm going to delete that as well. So now it's pretty clean. From here, we see that what this index.js file does is it creates a variable called root. Root is essentially a React object, a React root object. And we create that with the React dom.createRoot function. And we input the HTML element where we want the actual HTML element to be as like the root, which is the element that has an ID of root, which is the div that we just saw. And from that, we say root.render this app component. We actually don't need the strict mode. If you're developing your own React site, I would recommend you have the strict mode on, but this just makes things confusing when we're learning, so I'm just going to delete that. So it just renders an app component. So what is the app component? The app component is in the app.js file. And all these code are used to sort of run the template, so I'm just going to delete all that. And from here, we can head over to our site, and now it's blank. We don't have the template anymore because we deleted everything that is related to the template, and we, of course, deleted everything in the app component. This app component is what will actually be rendered on the screen. So we can go ahead and write our first component. The first component will be the whole page. So every single component is a function. So to write an app component, we just have to define a function. I'm just going to call it app. So const app equals to a function. We're going to use an arrow function. And inside this function, we simply return the HTML that is rendered by this component. So we say return. And inside return, we have a parentheses. And inside these return, we're going to type in the HTML that we want to render. So we want to recreate this people watching club. So it looks like this is a div, so I'm just going to write a div. And inside this div, there's people watching club. It's most likely in H1, so I'm going to do that. And then here we have some text about what humans are, in case you don't know what that is. And then we have the button, more info to console. We're going to explain this in a little bit. So button, more info to console. Head over to our React app, and it says, oh, export default imported as app was not found. Why? Because we can't really use this function, this component right here, in this file, because it's written in this file. So in order for us to use this code in this file, we have to export this function from this file. So export default app. What this does is it exports the app function. Default just means if I don't specify what to export or what to import, I'm going to import the app function. So from here, we're importing app from this file and then rendering it. And now it should work. People watching club, some text about what humans are, and then a button. Now this div spans the whole thing because that's what divs do. So maybe I want to style it. Maybe I want this whole div to maybe just take up, I don't know, 60% of the whole web page, because this takes up maybe around 60%. So we want to use CSS. So how do we style a React app? We style a React app by creating a CSS file, like how we would style in HTML. So app.css. I'm going to click this button here for creating a new file, app.css. And in the CSS, I'm going to write div, and then I'm going to write width is maybe around 60%. And it will not work because I just wrote a CSS file and I did not connect it to anything. So obviously it won't work. To connect a CSS file in React, all we have to do is import the CSS file, like how we would import a typical JavaScript file. In React, we can actually import CSS files. And what it does is essentially just injects the CSS into the web page. So we're just going to type import and then a string. And inside the string, I'm going to point to the CSS file. So this directory, which is /app.css. Once we imported the CSS, we can head over to our site, and we can see that the CSS has been applied, and the width is 60%. Now, we may also want to center this div. So we're going to head over to this div CSS here, and then we're going to write maybe margin auto. So this will automatically adjust the margin such that it will be horizontally centered. So now we have a centered div. So that's how we write CSS in React. So let's try and create these cards one by one. First, we're going to try and recreate this little thing here. This looks like a div with an image and h1 and then a paragraph. So right after this div, I'm going to write another div. And you'll see here that the compiler is yelling at us. And the reason for this is because in React, we actually can't return multiple HTML elements. We can only return one. And this one HTML element can contain multiple HTML elements inside of it, but it can only be one. To solve this problem, we can write what's called a React fragment, which is just an HTML tag that's like an empty HTML tag, like so. Wrap everything around that. This just sort of tells the HTML file that we're rendering nothing, but it tells React that we are rendering one gigantic element that contains all these content. So now we can write our next div. Our next div contains an image, a title, and a coordinate. So I'm going to write image. And of course, image, we don't need to write any text here, right? That makes no sense. So I'm going to close that off immediately. And then you might have an attribute, source, which is where the image will come from. It will come from this image. So I'm just going to copy wherever this image came from. Copy image address. So now we have an image, and we see here that we have an image. Now this image is pretty big because that's just how large the image is. We can head over to our CSS file and maybe style the image and make the image as wide as the container, as a div. So we're going to say max width is 100%. So you can only go as wide as your container. So that shortens the image. From here, we can write the title, Eiffel Tower. So I'm going to write H1 Eiffel Tower. And then after that, I can write these coordinates. And we can see here that we have a card rendered. Let's say I want to create this card. Now this card is exactly the same, except we have a different image, a different title, and a different coordinate. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste this div right here. Copy, down, paste. And we have another card. And I'm just going to change this image to this image. Oh boy. And then I'm going to change the title to this title. You can start to see how painful things are without React. I'm going to change this coordinate to this coordinate. And then, yay, we have another card. Okay, so I'm going to create the third component. I'm just kidding, I'm not going to do that. It's very, very annoying. If you do this like maybe 10 times, it gets really time consuming. So instead of doing that, I'm going to define a component. And this component is going to be this chunk of div, this chunk of HTML, and then we can just reuse it. So to create a new component, you create a new file. It's best to create a new file for every single component. So I'm going to call this component infocard, infocard.js. A component name starts, the first letter of the component name is capitalized, which is not like HTML tags. So again, to write a React function, to write a React component, we write a function. So const infocard equals to an arrow function. And in this function, we return the HTML that we want to render. And in this case, I'm going to copy this chunk of div right here. So we're returning one div. Inside this div, we have an image, h1, and a paragraph. And of course, do not forget to export your components. It's a very, very common mistake. Always export your components because you want to use them in other files. So export default info card. Once we have that exported, we want to use that in this app.js file. To use other components in app.js file, we want to import it. So import, I'm going to call it info card from a string which points to the file, this directory / info card, that file. So it imports whatever is in this file, which is info card, which is this function, which is that component. So now we can actually use it in our HTML. And here we can actually just maybe delete this and replace it with a component, this component. And we do that with a very, very similar syntax. So the way we write it is very similar to how we would write an HTML element. So you can think of React as building your own HTML elements. So I'm going to open an angle bracket right here and then just write info card. as if it's its own HTML component. Now, we don't need text in between, so I'm just going to delete that and close it immediately, like so. And if we head over to our site, everything renders correctly. So instead of writing all this junk right here, all I have to do is duplicate this down. Perfect. Much cleaner. But the problem is they're both Eiffel Towers, which is not good. So how do we make components render slightly differently? The problem here is we're rendering this every single time, right? So maybe we can add some attributes to this particular component and have it render different things. So the syntax for that is exactly the same as HTML attributes. So in here we just write maybe image. By the way, this image is just like a made-up name. You can name it anything. You can name it source if you want. So I'm going to say image equals to a string. The string is going to be this image. Copy image address. And I'm going to break things off a little bit so that it's slightly more readable. And then maybe a second attribute is title, and then the third attribute is its coordinates. So that's the unique thing that defines this particular thing, this component. So name equals to the Eiffel Tower, and then we have the fact that this is not orange scares me. Oh, would you look at that? Okay. Yeah, strings should be orange. Alrighty. And then here we have coordinates, so maybe I'm just going to name coordinates. Coordinates, okay. Sometimes when you spell things, you do that. And then you paste that in, and then we have, well, nothing changes because we haven't defined what's in the component yet, right? So similarly, let's say we want this to have different attributes, right? Different properties. We want this image to be like a different image. We want this image to be like the Empire State Building image. So we copy that URL in here, and then we have name equals to the Empire State Building, and then we have the coordinates as the Empire State coordinates. Why does it keep doing this? That's interesting. Anyways, now it still doesn't do anything. Because if you think about it, if we head over to our component, it's still rendering the same thing. So if you think about what a component is a function. A function takes in inputs. So it's natural that this function takes in an input. And this input is called props. Props stands for properties. Properties define what this component, what defines the properties of these components. So in here, we're going to actually log this component. Sorry, we're going to log props to see what it looks like. And in here, I'm going to head over to the console, and we see two objects. The first component has a props object with an attribute of coordinates. This is impossible to see. Okay. The first component has a prop object with an attribute of coordinates, image, and name with its own value. The second component has its own props with its own set of props with different values. And this is actually very important because we want to render different things every single time. So we head over to our info card component. And in here, we can actually inject. So to access the image in props, we just say props.image, right? It's a typical object. So in the source right here, I can actually inject props.image. Now, of course, you don't do this because that's the literal URL. So you type in JavaScript. Now, in React, you can actually write JavaScript inside HTML. And you do that with curly brackets. So inside these curly brackets, I'm going to write props.image. And this will compile into the actual image URL and then insert it in the source. Similarly, we do that with the title. So in here, I'm going to write JavaScript, props.name. And then in here, I'm going to write more JavaScript, props.coordinates. We head over to our site, and voila, it works. I get really happy when things work because things break a lot. So Eiffel Tower, unique set of coordinates, Empire State Building, unique set of coordinates. And you can see just how clean this code is. No duplication, just exactly what you need. An info card and the exact things that are unique about this particular info card, and no duplication because we write this component once in one file. So that's pretty much it. we can head over to our this thing that we're trying to clone here, and we can actually analyze its source code and see what we did maybe slightly differently. So in here, this is the actual, is it this one? Yeah. In here, we have the source code for the original website that we're trying to clone. So everything else, everything is the same pretty much. We have, we're importing an app.css, we're importing the component, and then we're defining the function, yada, yada, yada. And then here we are creating a gigantic div, which is totally fine too, because you're still returning one element technically. Inside here, we have class name. Now, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the class attribute. Is the sort of hook, it allows CSS to sort of hook onto to style stuff. In React, you can't use the word class because class is actually a reserved keyword in JavaScript because you use class to create classes, and we can't use class. So we're going to have to use class name in camel case. The only other attribute that does this is for forms. It's HTML4. That's pretty much it, I think. If you want to look into the details of this, you can always look in the docs. So everything else is the same. Class name equals to some class name. And then here, in here, we have the exact same thing. We have the intro, and then we have this button here, and then we have an on-click attribute. An on-click attribute, and this is something we will use a lot next week, is essentially, what it essentially does is it defines a JavaScript function that simply runs when you click on that particular button. So in here, say on-click equals to, we open up curly brackets, and inside these curly brackets, because we're writing JavaScript, so we'll open up curly brackets, and inside these curly brackets, we're writing a function, and in this function, we are just logging two things. So if we head over to the actual site and we inspect, we click the button, and it actually logs the two things. Here's some info and a link to Eiffel Tower. And the rest is pretty much the same. We have 3 info cards with a name, a coordinate, image, name, coordinate, image, with no duplications there. And then we have the info card, which is defined pretty much the same way with props, with props.image, props.name, and props.coordinates. So that's pretty much all you need to know for React for now. Next week, we'll go over states, which is extremely commonly used. But for now, that's pretty much it. Oh, quiz. Almost forgot. We actually have a quiz. We actually have a quiz that we've been making and keep forgetting.
So much better than me.
So if you want to join, just go in that URL and type in the number, and we're going to move into the Halloween social. So hope to see you guys next week.
Honestly,